Let's go now to Tim, who's going to share some frequently asked questions or some answers for figures.
So the first one is about abbreviations. Are abbreviations okay? Yes, and in fact, if you have multiple items labeled in a figure, in the body of a figure, abbreviations are often very helpful. And you just need to remember to define them in the note. So you can see that highlighted in this example. The thing to keep in mind is that readers should be able to look at a figure and understand it on its own without having to consult the text to understand any of the abbreviations. So even though you defined an abbreviation at the first time it appeared in the paper, um, you would still define any abbreviation in the figure itself, in the note, usually in the note. So just assume that a reader might pick up your article or your work and look at a figure right away, and they should be able to understand it. So the most typical way to define abbreviations is shown here in this note. You can see IFC equals inferior frontal cortex and so on. But if we look at the next example on this slide, it's also possible to define an abbreviation right in the title, as you can see in this example. So, how would you choose? You can pick the option that you feel is most clear to readers. For example, if there's just one abbreviation, doing that in the title is clear, and it might even save you space in the note. Certainly would save you space in the note, and if you didn't have anything else for the note, you might not even have a note. So, but if you have multiple abbreviations, usually putting it in the note is the best way to define them. And you should just be mindful to be consistent in your approach across all the figures in your paper, so that it's clear to a reader. So if one figure defines all the abbreviations in a note, I'd recommend doing that consistently. The next question is how to show p-values. There's a lot to discuss with p-values. I'm not going to dig into it too deeply, but p-values are shown in figures in a probability note, which is just our name for the new paragraph that begins at the end of the general note. You can see that in this example. APA style recommends providing exact p-values to 2 or 3 decimal places. For example, you might write that p equals 0.03. However, if the value is less than 0.001, you can just write p is less than 0.001, as you, again, can see in this example. It's important to note that p-values should be, again, consistent across the tables and figures within a given paper. So if your other figures defined a single asterisk as p is less than 0.05, that should be how a single asterisk is defined across all the tables and figures. And that's why in this example, we have p is less than 0.001 defined with 3 asterisks. Even though there are no other p-values in this particular figure, it was consistent on how p-values were defined across the other figures in the paper that this came from. Right, next slide. Yeah, thank you. If you've used data from another work to create your figure, how do you cite those other works? So I'm happy to say this one's easy. You cite the other works the same way you would cite other works in text. So you use the usual in-text citations in the sentences in the note, or sometimes even in the body of the figure. And then you include a reference to, or references to, those other sources in the list that correspond to these citations as usual. So I have 2 examples here. The first one is on screen, and the in-text citations are there in the notes. And then on the next example, you can see that they're in the figure itself, which is fine. One thing to notice about the Klimt and Alvu citation is, that's the one on the bottom right, is that we use an ampersand, even though it's sort of in regular text, but to conserve space, we recommend using an ampersand when citations appear in the body of a figure or table. So the citations are either in the body, as this one, or in the note, as in the previous one, and then in the reference list, the reader can go look at those original sources if they want to see that data in context. These were cases where I used data to create, from other works, to create my own new figure. So it's my figure, even though the data I'm reflecting here was gathered and reported by someone else in their own paper. So I'm just citing their work. On the next slide, which is the last FAQ, we'll see an example where someone has already created a figure and I just want to use it. So can you do that? Probably. You may be able to use a chart or a photograph or a different type of image from someone else's paper, but there's just a little more to it than right click and save. So for figures you got from another article, usually the publisher and not the author has ownership of the copyright. So once it's been published. So you can usually go to the publisher's website and find information about whether they will allow people to reproduce these figures from their works. Sometimes they just have a blanket guideline that says authors can reproduce figures within a certain limit that they specify, particularly for research and educational purposes. Academic publishers are used to this kind of thing and have clear guidelines posted. If you have the permission, then you would just need to provide the appropriate language in the figure notes that gives credit to the original source, as you can see here. In other cases, you may not find that kind of general permission statement, so you need to write the publisher and ask for permission. And then if you do get it, again, you just put the language in the note. The language looks a little bit like a full reference. It's just formatted a little differently. The exact wording to use you can find in Chapter 12, Section 12.18 of the publication manual. And you should use that wording unless the copyright holder has given some other specific wording. That happens where they want to require that you use whatever they want, and then that's what you would do. A couple more things here. Note in this example, it says from and then the details. If you made changes to the figure, if you've highlighted some data or cropped something to draw attention, really any changes, you change the word from to adapted from. It's a pretty simple change. Let's see. So there's a similar situation. This example has been about figures from an article, but it's a similar thing if you have a photograph from a website that you want to use. In that case, you just need to contact someone on the website and request permission to use it. And as long as they give you permission, you can include the image with the copyright language in the note. Although it may be a photo or an illustration online, you're going to put it into this figure format that Jasmine talked about. So you've got the figure number and the title, and then the image and the figure body, and then the note at the end. And I think that's the last one, and off to Chelsea.